June 19, 1944. A pale dawn slipped across the Pacific and turned the water under the carrier task force into a sheet of hammered silver. 50,000 feet below that glitter, the wooden decks of American carriers were already humming, mechanics with grease-black hands, aircrews hauling fuel and ordnance, signalmen waving flags that fluttered like punctuation in the salt wind. Up in the thin, cold air, 90 inches of G-plates and aluminum, and the smell of castor and hot oil, a young naval lieutenant checked his instruments with hands that did not shake. Lieutenant Alexander Vrasiu glanced across the cockpit of his Grumman F6F Hellcat, listening to the growl of the Pratt & Whitney R2800 as if it were the heartbeat of something larger than himself, of a nation and an industry that had learned to speak in horsepower. The canopy was fogged with his breath in the chill. He could hear radios crackle distant voices, the clipped cadence of squadron chatter, bogey sighted, Vector 210. Over the intercom, his section leader's voice sounded like a commandment. Stick to altitude, keep your 6, trust the Hellcat. Below, a black wedge of enemy aircraft moved like a living shadow. The Japanese strike force, dozens, then hundreds of Mitsubishi A6M0s and twin-engine bombers, had come out of the morning to try to break the carriers. Eyes on the deck watchers, the Japanese pilots had seen pictures of the new American fighter and laughed in their briefing rooms. Stubby fuselage, a wide fuselage that looked cumbersome, a cockpit set too far forward, a flying dump truck, one propagandist teethed into his notes. Mockery is easy when you still have faith in your legend. The first contact was a brightness tracer threads that laced the blue. Vrasiu rolled his Hellcat into an intercept, and the world sharpened to wire-thin focus. The hiss of slipstream across his oxygen mask, the metallic ping as gun barrels cooled, the sight picture of a Zero's slender fuselage sliding under his reticle. A formation of Zeros tried to peel through altitude and sun, hopping to use maneuverability and the morning glare to split the American fighters. That was the Japanese plan: out-turn, out-climb, out-dance. Only the plan met a wall of speed, armor, and concentrated fire. Vrasiu's Hellcat bit into the enemy with a confidence the older F4F Wildcat could not muster, 6 Browning .50 caliber machine guns in the wings that spat lead in sustained bursts, a rugged airframe that shrugged off hits that would have brought down a lighter fighter. When the first Zero's engine coughed, then fired, then exploded like a wet candle, the pilot in its cockpit did not have the cushion of distance or the room to recover. Pieces of skin and silk and metal peeled away and fell, glittering, into the Pacific. On the radio someone cursed and then, with stunned sharpness, laughed. "Did you see that wing?" murmured a pilot over the net. "It didn't spiral out, it held." Accounts would later call the morning a slaughter. Pilots would call it the Great Mariana's turkey shoot. But in the moment, there was only the immediate arithmetic of speed and metal and luck. Vrasiu dove, throttled back to let a pursuing Zero overshoot, and then he came up beneath it like a blade. The first burst sprayed into the enemy tank, and the aircraft burst into flame. He watched the orange blossom of an enemy plane fold and begin its slow, human fall. Across the sky, other Hellcats were doing the same. A pair of Hellcats peeled back to back and ripped through a section of Zeros that had expected to dance them to death. Where the Zero relied on graceful, breath-stealing turns, the Hellcat used mass and momentum and enough raw firepower to punish mistakes and end engagements fast. The difference wasn't elegant, it was brutal and practical. For every graceful evasion the Zero attempted, there was a Hellcat pilot who had been drilled to close, hit, and get away, not to trade acrobatics for endurance. Some Japanese pilots, watching from their cockpits as friends tumbled from the sky, felt that old arrogance crumble into something cold and new. A lieutenant in a Zero squadron gripped his stick and thought of the morning's briefing where the Hellcat had been mockingly described as ungainly. Now his plane was burning. His wingman had already gone down. The mockery was a scrap of the past. In its place rose a recognition that would change the way Japanese aviators fought from that day forward. From the carrier decks below, men cheered and cursed in the same breath as they watched their fighters dance and tear the enemy apart. A catapult officer spat a curse and then laughed, because the Hellcat had done what it was built to do: survive hits, return pilots home, and bring deadly return fire to the enemy. Lieutenant Vrasiu, scanning the sky, felt something like stunned gratitude. He had not come to the Pacific to change opinions. He had come because it was his duty. But when he radioed confirmation of another splashed bogey, there was a thrill that tasted like vindication. The flying dump truck, the ugly new Grumman fighter, was not simply surviving, it was ruling. The morning would end with scores tallied, radios buzzing with victory, and the sick tally of lost friends. But a seed had been planted. The Hellcat was not the awkward new boy to be mocked. It was the instrument that would tilt aerial war in the Pacific, one sloppy, terrible, incandescent dogfight at a time. Birth of the flying dump truck, Grumman's gamble. It began 2 years earlier, far from the roar of the Pacific, in a hangar on Long Island where the air smelled of oil, cigarettes, and wet aluminum. In early 1942, Grumman's engineering floor was a place of frantic invention. The Navy wanted a replacement for its aging F4F Wildcat, something faster, tougher, deadlier. The engineers worked under fluorescent lights so long their shadows seemed permanent on the floor. Lead designer Iron Works, Leary Grumman walked among them with a cup of cold coffee in his hand, tapping blueprints with a pencil eraser and muttering to himself. The Wildcat had been heroic, yes, but outdated. It couldn't climb or turn with the Japanese Zero, and pilots knew it. Too many never came back. The solution, Grumman decided, wasn't to build a prettier fighter. It was to build one that could win ugly. He wanted a cockpit with visibility that could let a pilot survive his first fight. He wanted a plane that could absorb punishment, lose cylinders, lose half a wing, and still bring its pilot home. "You can't make a fighter that can't take a punch," Grumman said once to his chief engineer, William Schwendler, while looking over an early Hellcat frame. "The men flying them don't have the luxury of elegance." The prototype rolled out under the internal name XF6F1. It looked wrong. The fuselage was thick and round like a barrel, the wings too broad. The nose enormous to fit the new Pratt and Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine, 2,000 horsepower of fire-breathing power. The test pilots climbed into the cockpit with suspicion. One of them, Commander Butch O'Hare, a Medal of Honor recipient and ace, looked at it and said, "It's not much to look at, but let's see what she does." What she did first was fight back. The Hellcat wasn't nimble like the Zero, but it was forgiving. It didn't stall easily. It could dive faster, hit harder, and survive hits that would shred a Zero to ribbons. On its test flights, pilots deliberately pushed it to the limit, tearing through cloud cover, pulling high-G dives until their vision blurred, landing hard enough to dent carrier decks. The Hellcat shrugged it off. But the Navy was skeptical. Early reports described it as too heavy, too slow to turn, and unrefined. Some officers called it a tank with wings. In Tokyo, intelligence reports and early photos of the F6F were passed around to pilots in mess halls. The laughter was real. The Japanese had spent years cultivating the legend of the Zero, the perfect blend of grace, agility, and warrior spirit. Against that, the Hellcat looked like a factory mistake. But what no one could see from those photographs was the logic behind its lines, the soul of industrial warfare. Grumman had built not just a fighter, but a fighter that could be mass-produced by the thousands. Its parts could be swapped between aircraft, its engine could be built by subcontractors, its frame required no rare materials. A damaged Hellcat could be repaired with a wrench and a welding torch, even on a rolling carrier deck. America didn't need beauty in the air, it needed momentum. And that momentum came from places like Bethpage, New York, where men and women in coveralls turned out new Hellcats every hour, and Akron, Ohio, where engines were tested through the night. The sound of riveting echoed through the country like distant thunder. By mid-1943, the first squadrons received their Hellcats, the VF-9 and VF-5, aboard USS Essex and USS Yorktown. Pilots were reluctant at first. They missed the Wildcat's tight turns, the nimble dogfight feel. One squadron leader wrote home, "This thing feels like a flying truck." He wasn't wrong. It was a truck, but one carrying 6 50 caliber Brownings, 800 rounds per gun, and armor thick enough to shrug off cannon shells. Then came the first real test, The Battle of Marcus Island, September 1943. Hellcats engaged the Zero for the first time. When the radio transcripts came back, the tone had changed. A pilot reported, breathless. "They can't touch us. You take a hit, it's like a slap, then you turn and they're gone." What had been skepticism became awe. The pilots began to understand what Grumman had built, not a dancer, but a brawler. It didn't need to pirouette through the sky. It just needed to hit harder, fly longer, and keep coming. By late 1943, carrier decks across the Pacific were filled with them, their wings folded like steel birds asleep. And on the other side of the ocean, Japanese intelligence began warning pilots to change tactics, to avoid prolonged engagements with the new American fighter. "Do not dogfight the Hellcat," one circular read. "Attack from above and disengage." But it was already too late. The dump truck had become the executioner. The turning tide, training, tactics, and total war. By early 1944, the Pacific had become a vast machine of motion. Carriers, destroyers, and oilers sweeping across the sea like a living city. On every deck, rows of F6F Hellcats sat folded and waiting, their blue-gray paint glinting under the morning sun. They no longer looked awkward or bulky to the men who flew them. To those pilots, the Hellcat had become a friend and a promise. Every new Navy pilot who stepped into one first met the instructors at Naval Air Station Pensacola or Oceana, men who had learned the hard way what the Hellcat could do. They trained for hours in tight loops, stalls, and combat dives. The mantra was simple: the Zero can't take what you can, don't fight on his terms. It was a reversal of everything pre-war doctrine had taught. Before, aerial combat was about finesse, elegant maneuvers, tight turns, perfect energy control. The Hellcat rewrote that book. It turned brute strength, armor, and firepower into survival. Commander David McCampbell, who would become America's top Navy ace, once said, "You didn't outdance them, you outfought them. The Hellcat let you walk away from mistakes that used to get you killed." That mindset, and the sheer number of aircraft rolling off U.S. assembly lines, began to show results. Every month, America built hundreds of Hellcats. They arrived faster than the Navy could assign squadrons. Spare parts filled hangars, and when one fighter went down, two more were waiting. It was industrial warfare translated into wings and bullets. Meanwhile, Japan's pilots were bleeding out their experience. The veterans of Pearl Harbor, Coral Sea, and Midway, men who had mastered the Zero, were gone. In their place came younger pilots, barely trained, flying aircraft that were still beautifully agile but fragile as paper. Japan's factories couldn't keep up. Its fuel reserves were collapsing, and its aircraft carriers were now outnumbered 5-1. In that environment, the Hellcat was the perfect predator. Its radar-assisted intercepts allowed squadrons to see incoming raids before they were visible. Its 6 heavy Brownings could tear through even the nimblest Zero in seconds, and its rugged airframe let pilots absorb hits, return to the carrier, and fight again that same day. Aboard the USS Enterprise, Lieutenant Junior Grade Eugene Valencia ran his gloved hand across the Hellcat's nose before takeoff, murmuring like a ritual, "You bring me back, I'll bring you home." His squadron launched in formation, propellers kicking up salt spray. When they met the enemy, it was no longer an equal duel. The Hellcats dove through formation after formation of Zeros, heavy, decisive, unrelenting. The Japanese still tried to use their legendary turning ability, but the Americans had learned to fight differently. They climbed, dove, and struck from altitude, using boom and zoom tactics perfected through hundreds of engagements. Some Japanese pilots realized the futility Medea. One, Ensign Yoshiro Hattori, wrote in his diary before a sortie, "We once ruled the sky with grace, now they rule it with numbers and steel." He never returned from that mission. On the ground, captured Japanese airmen began telling their interrogators the same story: disbelief, then dread. They described how the barrel-shaped American fighter could take hits and still fly, how even when they riddled it with 20 shells, it just kept coming. "It's like shooting at a mountain, one said. It bleeds, but it doesn't die. The Battle of the Philippine Sea made that reputation permanent. In June 1944, waves of Japanese aircraft launched desperate strikes against Admiral Spruance's task force. Hellcats rose to meet them, hundreds of them. When the smoke cleared, the air over the Marianas was filled with burning debris. The Americans had destroyed over 300 Japanese aircraft in a single day, at a loss of fewer than 30 of their own. The kill ratio, 19-1. The term "turkey shoot" was coined by laughing pilots that evening, but the laughter was hollow. Even among the victors, there was an understanding that something irreversible had happened. The sky over the Pacific no longer belonged to the rising sun. It belonged to the Hellcat. From that point on, the F6F wasn't just a plane, it was a symbol of inevitability. Wherever the Hellcat flew, Japanese opposition melted away. Carrier decks, once the pride of the Imperial Navy, burned under waves of American fighters that seemed endless. But behind those victories was something deeper, the quiet triumph of industry, of engineering, and of ordinary men who learned to trust an aircraft they once mocked. And as 1945 drew near, the Hellcats' pilots and their enemies would face the final, desperate battles of the Pacific, where the legend of the flying dump truck would meet its ultimate test. Fire over the Empire, the Hellcats' final ascendancy. February 16, 1945, dawn over Tokyo Bay. For the first time in the war, American carrier planes were preparing to strike the Japanese homeland itself. On the deck of the USS Bunker Hill, a line of F6F Hellcats sat with canopies open and pilots waiting for the signal to launch. The sea was still, heavy with mist, and the sun was just a dull red smear behind the haze of burning fuel from earlier raids. Lieutenant Clarence Bill Davenport, 22 years old, checked his altimeter one more time. His knuckles were white on the throttle. He could smell the faint tang of cordite and sweat inside his mask. The deck officer gave the signal, a single forward sweep of his arm, and the Hellcat roared to life, launching into the low gray sky. Below him, the city stretched out like a scar. Factories, warehouses, rail yards, all targets. The Japanese early warning network barely had time to react before the Hellcats arrived, diving through scattered clouds. Anti-aircraft fire bloomed around them like deadly fireworks, but the F6Fs held their line. The Zero squadrons that rose to meet them were a shadow of what they once were: fewer planes, fewer veterans, many flown by young men with only weeks of training. They came climbing into the sunlight with brave hearts and trembling hands. When the first formation engaged, the outcome was instant. Hellcats dove out of the sun, tearing through the interceptors with disciplined bursts. Japanese aircraft disintegrated mid-turn, their thin skins ripped apart by the Hellcats' heavy guns. Where once the Zero could dance and evade, now its every maneuver was met with relentless precision and overwhelming firepower. Davenport's voice came over the radio, tight with adrenaline. "I'm hit, port wing still flying, returning fire." He rolled, lined up a Zero that had overshot, and squeezed the trigger. Tracers reached out like burning threads. The enemy plane erupted, spun downward, and vanished into the haze. Davenport steadied his aircraft. The wing was torn, smoking, but the Hellcat stayed steady, unbroken. That was the difference. For every Japanese pilot who risked everything on a single perfect maneuver, the Hellcat pilot could afford mistakes. Armor behind the cockpit, self-sealing fuel tanks, rugged landing gear, each feature was designed to keep the man alive. In the Pacific, survival was victory. In those months, Task Force 58 swept across the Japanese Empire like a storm. From Iwo Jima to Okinawa, Hellcats provided air cover, ground strikes, and fleet defense. They dueled the last remnants of Japan's air arm and escorted bombers that turned cities into firestorms. It was a cruel transformation for both sides. For American pilots, the war had shifted from fear to fatigue, endless sorties, endless targets. For the Japanese, it had shifted from pride to desperation. Young kamikaze pilots now filled the sky, aiming not to duel but to die. The Hellcat became their last obstacle between the horizon and the American fleet. April 1945, Okinawa. The sea boiled with smoke and shrapnel as wave after wave of suicide planes dove toward the anchored ships. From above, squadrons of Hellcats clawed at them, cutting them down before they could strike. It was brutal, relentless work. There was no honor left, only endurance. In the ready rooms after missions, pilots stared at the chalkboards tallying kills, numbers blurred into exhaustion. They joked about flying dump trucks again, but now the words carried affection. The Hellcat had become more than a plane. It was a companion that absorbed the war's cruelty and kept its pilots breathing. By the time Japan surrendered, the statistics were staggering. 5,163 aerial victories credited to Hellcat pilots, nearly 75% of all U.S. Navy air kills in the Pacific, a kill ratio of 19-1, the kind of dominance no aircraft in history had ever achieved before or would again. When the war ended, many of the surviving Zeros were found abandoned on airfields, their once-proud silhouettes rusting under tropical sun. The machine that had once symbolized Japan's mastery of the skis now sat beside the one that had dethroned it, squat, heavy, and utterly victorious. In the hangars, pilots like Davenport ran a hand along the scarred fuselage of their Hellcats one last time before climbing down for good. "She never let me down," one said quietly, half to himself. And somewhere in the archives of the defeated empire, a Japanese pilot's diary, recovered from an airbase on Kyushu, contained a final entry written the night before his last sortie. "They built theirs from steel, we built ours from spirit. But steel, it seems, can fly longer." That was the story of the Grumman F6F Hellcat, the plane Japan mocked, America mass-produced, and history crowned the ruler of the Pacific skis.